the critic who counts, not the person who points out how the strong person stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man or the woman who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends him or herself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he or she fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his or her place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat.
Hello, and welcome to Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future. When we think about Virginia and our society today, there's a lot of things we take for granted. For instance, if you go into a classroom and ask girls about when was it that they earned the right to vote, most might not even be able to answer the question. Little do they realize that it wasn't until the year 1920 that women were granted the right to vote thanks to the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. And with this passage, we entered into a new era of what could certainly be considered civility for the United States. For now, all genders in this country were able to vote. But when it comes to this, there still is a fascinating tale to be told as to how we were able to go from just a single gender voting base to both genders being involved. And joining me today is Lynn Garvey Hodge of the Fairfax County Historical Commission, and clearly very much dressed in that period of attire to show us the suffragist movement in its full swing. So welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here, Andrew.
And so I have to ask very simply, as your attire shows, you're one of the most uniquely dressed guests I think we've ever had. And so one of the things I can't help but notice is that today, with Macy's celebrating its anniversary, they have a nice rare black and white shot of a woman dressed almost like you entering in there. But the one thing I know she is definitely not wearing is the I guess the sash going across. And can you tell us a little about that?
I'd be happy to. The sash represents the Suffragist colors, and the Suffragists very intentionally chose purple and white and yellow to represent their cause. Purple stood for dignity and loyalty. In other words, dignity and loyalty to be able to be both patriotic but dignified to be able to vote. The white stood for purity. It also was the color of the Prohibition era and those that were supporting the temperance movement. And much of that movement and the suffragist movement overlapped. And the yellow represents the golden rays of the sun and the future. It also represents the sunflower, which is the state flower of Kansas. Kansas is a state that ironically once had the vote for women, once women were allowed to vote there, lost it, and then they had to fight to get it back again. So it's a reminder that having the right to vote is something that is very precious and something that really any of us could lose.
And certainly a scary thought to think of. Now, I was always under the impression that it was Wyoming that granted women the right to vote first on the state level. When did Kansas get involved with this?
Wyoming was. Kansas and a number of the other western states were part of the early 1800s. They became states and joined the Union with an understanding that women could have the right to vote. In fact, that was one of the things the suffragists would get so frustrated with, was how many states in the West did allow the right to vote and how much of a struggle it was in the East to achieve that same right to vote.
Now, when we hear suffragist, I'm always reminded of suffragette. Mm-hmm. Because that seemed to be a much more feminine tone to it. Is there a difference?
There is. The term suffragette specifically refers to the ladies that fought for the right to vote in England. And they achieved the right to vote before we did here in the United States. Sadly, their cause was marred by a lot of hostility, some vandalism, and some property destruction. And so when the suffragists really tried to take on their cause here in the United States, they wanted a slightly different reference, and so suffragist became the accepted term that we used here in the United States.
Okay. And as for the suffragists, when they were involved, what hardships did they find?
Well, quite a few, and let me rewind this all just a little bit, Andrew. Back in 1848 was the original Seneca Falls Convention. That is where we hear about Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony. Those were the ladies that helped make that convention happen back in 1848. And many of them were Quakers. The Quaker religion is one that believes in equality and same rights for all human beings. They were very ardent in the abolitionist movement, and so part of that energy came together by the time 1848 rolled around, because so many women were clear they could be educated and make a difference if they could have the right to vote. So in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention, the Declaration of Sentiments was drafted, and it was based very similarly to some of the early drafting of language in the founding of our country, only it also represented the realities of the things that women could not do. They could not hold property, they could not hold public office. There were a number of professions they could not be involved in. And so at that Seneca Falls Convention, about 100 people signed off on that actual Declaration of Sentiments. And it seemed like things were going pretty full swing, because Seneca Falls at that time was a very strong economic base. There was a lot of industry there. It was a thriving community. It was kind of the place to be in New York, where things were happening, where there was education and change and a sense of hope and difference for the future of the United States. Well, as you might guess, from 1848 to the 1860s, a lot of different things happened in our country, including the whole slavery issue. So sadly, during the Civil War, a lot of that suffragist energy was set aside. After the Civil War, however, though, with the hope that the war would have allowed opportunities for women to naturally step into the opportunity to vote, it seemed that there was a need to remind Congress that, you know, wait a minute, we've just had this war for equality, and what happened to the women? So in the early 1900s, things began to change. And in 1910, and of all places, a police station in London, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns met, and they are the two ladies that we can say, among so many others, had a tremendous amount of energy and input into the creation of the suffragist movement. They did learn from their British sisters, though, that it would be far better not to be destructive in trying to change things. They were portrayed beautifully in the movie Iron-Jawed Angels, and Lucy Burns was the little redhead, and Alice Paul was the strategist for a lot of the suffragist energy. And they staged a lot of peaceful picketing in front of the White House to try to encourage Woodrow Wilson to do what he claimed he would do as he was coming into office. He did say he was supportive of the suffragist movement, and sadly, after becoming president, though, and after being elected as president, did not follow through on that. So in March of 1913, when he was to come back to the city, an enormous parade was staged to tell him that there are many women, 20 million women, in fact, who need to have the right to vote. And with all that ended up going on with World War I and our statements about democracy in Europe and how we were fighting for democracy over there, of course the suffragists took all that energy and many of the quotes to support their cause. And so the influence also of the Quaker background was present in the suffragist movement. One of our slogans was out of darkness and into light. And so that became one of the realities, and again, back to the yellow color of the colors that we wear. And I can tell you some more specifics about that.
Well, that's certainly very interesting. Now, the Iron-Jawed Angels, I've never heard of the film before. When was it made?
I believe it was made about 5 or 6 years ago. Yes, Hilary Swank played the role of Alice Paul in it. And it is actually a very accurate representation of what happened to many of the suffragists. Interestingly enough, and what I have found so fascinating as a member of the History Commission here in Fairfax County, is how many were taken to the Occoquan Workhouse, which was opposite where we knew Lorton Reformatory and Prison sat. And in 1917, over 123 women were taken to that Occoquan Workhouse and tortured, beaten, treated in very severe fashion. Some were force-fed, some were put in solitary confinement. They endured actually the very sad tragedy of the officials who were running the workhouse would encourage the African American girls to beat up on the white suffragists, many of whom were white, and of course the African American women wanted their right to vote too. And so the prison officials saw kind of a line of demarcation there that they could take advantage of. They also were very concerned that if that African American energy for equality and the suffragist right for equality combined, it could have been pretty volatile, and they could have dealt with some riots. Not that that ever did happen or was planned. That is why those dynamics were put in place. It was a very unfortunate, very heinous time in terms of our nation's history.
Now, I've never heard of this particular incident with Occoquan and the women being sent down there, and I think a lot of people, it's almost safe to say, probably have no idea about it whatsoever. I mean, this time period, usually you get the glossed over facts and the story.
Exactly.
What happened, per se, with Occoquan? Why is it that 123 plus, I assume then, women, what led to them being thrown to prison?
Well, on January 10th of 1917, part of the strategy that Alice Paul and Lucy Burns decided upon was to begin to quietly picket in front of the White House. And so they made these enormous banners, white banners with purple letters, all hand sewn. They were actually very beautiful. And they would say things like equality, you know, and fraternity and liberty, virtually the same things that were being said over in Europe in the war for democracy over there. And so after a number of months, and every day there were suffragists sitting there, every day in front of the White House, it became quite an embarrassment to the Wilson administration. And so eventually there was advisement that what to do with these women was to arrest them. Well, that wasn't to be done quite right away because they didn't want to have the issue of martyrdom going on. And yet it was an embarrassment as President Wilson continued to try to run his administration. So by June of that year, the local population also was not terribly kind to the suffragists then that were doing this, because the word obviously came out through the newspaper and so forth. And people would come down and watch and jeer and that kind of thing. And those people that did not want to necessarily have women have the right to vote, certainly the whole temperance perspective, a lot of men felt that this would mean they would never be able to have access to alcohol again, which of course was not part of the suffragist movement. But as a way to try to kind of keep everything going, we continue to do the picketing. The suffragists continue to do the picketing. And so they ended up being arrested, though, for obstructing traffic. That ended up being the root cause for these arrests that happened then abundantly throughout 1917. The worst case happened on November 15th, called the Night of Terror, when 40 suffragists were taken to the Occoquan Workhouse and brutally treated. In fact, one elderly woman who was 65 years old was thrown down a flight of stairs. So it was just a very, very, I would say, kind of shameful time, and a time that I think a lot of us would like to forget, and yet I think as women we really do need to remember this so that we keep sacred the right to vote in this country.
Now, you mentioned before that the women were tortured. Now, the term torture does get thrown around quite a bit.
Sure.
And so one generation's definition of torture might seem as, oh, well, that doesn't seem so bad. For instance, if a parent spanks a child, oh, well, that's just abuse. Well,
Right.
some would just say that's disciplining.
Right,
But what did these women go through so that when they said they were being tortured, would we definitely classify that from then to now as definitive torture, or is this generational torture?
I would say it was definitive torture, particularly in how they were initially treated. The timeline for what would happen when they would arrive at Occoquan would be they would be immediately stripped and have their clothes taken away. Almost all suffragists who picketed and who marched in parades came dressed in their Sunday finery to make the statement that they were ladies first, as in what Abigail Adams had said to John Adams as the doctrine for this country was being written. She said, you know, John, remember the ladies. So that term is very important, one for how the suffragists portrayed themselves. So to show up and be immediately stripped of and have all their clothes taken away, their glasses taken away, those that wore glasses had their undergarments taken away, were stripped into group showers and put on coarse clothing, and then were told to sit in silence. So they really had almost a, not exactly solitary confinement, but they could not speak to one another. They were given food that was incredibly unacceptable, soup that would have worms in it. In fact, one of the games that some of the suffragists would play at Occoquan was to count the number of worms they had in their soup for one of their meals. And finally, one day when one young lady found 15 worms in her soup, they decided it wasn't a funny game anymore. They were forced to do very significant labor. They had to make clothes for the male prisoners across the way. They were not given proper hygiene, toiletries, and given just the bare necessity of a blanket and put into a cell. And many of them, after being treated thusly and not having the situation lighten up, then went on hunger strikes. And when that happened, a number of suffragists were tied down in straitjackets and force-fed with a tube in their nose. And the movie Iron-Jawed Angels has a pretty grim portrayal of what that is like. And I would definitely call that torture in today's vernacular.
Definitely not something you'd want to have happen to you willingly,
Right.
much less forced upon you. And so clearly something like this most folks don't know much about. And so as you're dressed as a suffragist, what role do you take in order to explain to the youth of today exactly what happened to them, what seems like ancient history?
Right. Well, I portray, I do a monologue portraying a person called Mrs. Robert Walker. Amelia Himes is her name. And I tell her story. Her story is that she was a Quaker that had been raised in Pennsylvania. She is a real person who was arrested on July 14th in front of the White House. And you can imagine dressed like this in that kind of severe heat. And even though we might have had our sun parasols with us, it was incredibly hot. And so I tell people the story of what Mrs. Robert Walker's life was like. And she was a Swarthmore graduate, so she was very well educated. She was raised in a Quaker family, and Quakers, as I've mentioned, did very much believe in education, and they believed that if you educated a woman, you educated a family. And I've often thought that was a wonderful quote for all of us to carry with us. And so Mrs. Robert Walker ended up leaving her home in Pennsylvania after she finished college and landed in Baltimore, Maryland with her husband. And there she ended up leading the National Women's Party. And she did many things. She raised several children, and even her sons, as I portray her, were denied acceptance initially to the Naval Academy because their mother was thought of as a terrorist. And the neighbors would often scoff and jeer at Mr. Robert Walker and accuse him of not wearing the pants in the family and some other kinds of emasculating things like that because of what Mrs. Robert Walker or my position was in the community. So it's a fascinating character, and she was a real person. She loved to sing. She was an athlete, and we know she still was addressing Congress in speeches in 1956. So she was quite a person.
And around for quite a bit of time.
Yes.
And so why her specifically? What made you decide her?
Well, it was interesting when I was asked to participate in an event just this last summer, July of 2008. I was asked to consider portraying a suffragist, and I thought, well, it's time for me to find out who one actually was. Our local media here, the Fairfax Herald in particular, had very little coverage on what was going on with the suffragists. And I found a newspaper doing a lot of research online in California that had a wonderful article showing those of us, as if I were Mrs. Walker, on July 14th that had been arrested and taken to Occoquan Workhouse. And so that particular newspaper article gave me a lot of information about what in fact did happen at Occoquan. And so from there I took it a step further and did more research about who Mrs. Robert Walker was.
And are there a lot of women who do the same thing as you do, as portraying a suffragist, or are you like a one-of-a-kind feature that's very unique for us here in Northern Virginia?
Well, to be honest with you, Andrew, I think I'm the only one.
Huh?
I know there's other people that dress in period attire to represent that time, to actually be able to speak in first person and do a monologue. I am the only one I know of. There may be others out there, though.
Hopefully they'll be able to find a way to say, let's form a club or something along those lines.
That's right.
But I'm curious to go ahead and ask a quick question. And since you've spent so much time researching into Mrs. Walker, I'm curious to know if we can go ahead and ask her a question or two. Being a school teacher myself, I oftentimes find when I deal with the suffragist movement, I come up to the same issue every time. I talk about the 19th Amendment, the passage for women gaining the right to vote, and I hear the same thing every time from the boys. Biggest mistake ever made, where they say, we wish it got repealed. And it always seems to come up. I get that never fail from at least one student every year. And so for Mrs. Walker, I'm curious to know, why do you believe it is a necessity for women to be able to vote?
I think the biggest answer to that is that we need it for protection. And back in the 19 teens and even before that, as the industrial era really got underway, when women went back out into the workforce, and of course there was a real need for that after the Civil War because we had lost so many men, the factory conditions were abhorrent. And you'll even see, if you were to see the movie Iron-Jawed Angels, an example of someone who had worked in as a seamstress in a factory. But we needed that as a source of protection. Women needed to have domestic rights. Women needed to have the ability to protect themselves against injury, particularly in a domestic situation. Sadly, the whole temperance era and prohibition came about for, sadly, some reasons that we don't talk much about. The amount of pain and abuse, quite frankly, physical abuse that happened as a result of abuse of alcohol during that time was incredibly high. And so it almost became the kind of thing where women just wouldn't talk about sometimes how bad it would be at home. So protection is probably the biggest reason. And to be able to have a voice in the government that governed them. That is the biggest, I think today, the reality that is so very important, is to be able to be part of the world that affects all of us. And I know Mrs. Robert Walker, based on how she had been raised, and to speak in first person for her, I can tell you that, when my father made clear for all 6 of us children that to educate a woman was to educate a family, meant that we were expected to get out there and make a difference. We were expected to speak up in our Quaker meetings. We were expected to, if we moved to a new area, begin our own little Quaker meeting house and take all of that good energy with us. So as Mrs. Robert Walker, I could not do that. My Swarthmore background, always being aware of social issues and trying to change social ills, was very much a part of my background. So that really is a lot of how I came to be so involved and so passionate about the experience. And then, of course, after having been incarcerated at Occoquan, it made me even more passionate. And so I went out in 1919. There was the prison parade tour where those of us suffragists who had been so abused went around the country and spoke. And I went as far as San Francisco and other places in California and sat in parades in my prison garb. I did get to keep that, and spoke as I had been so ill-treated at Occoquan.
And certainly a very interesting time, and experiences alone brings it all together, and that's what makes such a very unique aspect into the world that we think of today.
Absolutely.
And so when we think about the suffragist movement itself, there's a lot of things that come to mind. And yes, there is still that attitude from the young that perhaps that's a time period that we shouldn't remember. But in reality, let's face it, there are many things in our past that we sometimes jokingly say, oh, we don't need to know it. But when you actually hear the story itself from those who had lived it and then those who try to portray it so that we have a better understanding of it, it certainly does bring quite a bit into our own world itself. That way we know that the past is something that we desperately do need to remember and can never afford to forget. And this particular episode was brought to you thanks in part to the Margarita and Donald J. Metzger Endowment. And in order to learn more about the suffragist movement and get other information regarding Virginia's history, please think of us and come to our website at www.timetravel21.com. Also, we ask that you go ahead and visit our friends over at the Fairfax County Historical Commission. And if you'd be very interested in trying to get a hold of Lynn Garvey Hodge to potentially come out and portray Mrs. Walker and explain the suffragist movement even more, certainly potential there. Just go ahead and check out their website if need be. But if you have other questions regarding Virginia history, please email us at timetravel21@yahoo.com. And thank you for once again coming in to view Virginia Time Travel, your portal to the Commonwealth's past, present, and future, where no matter how you look at it, the past is not a joke, and so we should never forget that those who suffered in the past is what gave us our freedoms and our rights that we have today.